And you mentioned really right from the start in 2000 or when you really first were working with your own uh, fears around public presentation, you identified the shame piece, and that's really kind of almost coming back in there now with in and around shame-based trauma or shame around identity or it's sort of it seems to be kind of coming back to that key aspect of what self-compassion really tries to help with is sort of moving away from the harsher self-hating shame-based self-criticism and towards something that's more like self-compassion and loving kindness and so on. So I wonder if we could talk a little bit about that piece. I mean, what is your take on shame and perhaps even like what is shame from your point of view?
Well, I've always appreciated, Stan, that you and I have been pretty focused on this topic of shame. You've been working perhaps more in the compassion-focused therapy world, but I would say 50% of what I know about shame comes from that work and also your wonderful work. And so, it's just a delight to be able to talk with you about shame because we've basically been swimming in the same pond, Well, so yeah, I mean, I can give the language to that. What is shame? It's often helpful to distinguish it from guilt, right? Shame means I am bad. Guilt means I did something bad. Guilt is more behavioral. Shame is more self-oriented. And shame is, as you mentioned earlier, a self-conscious emotion, which really means it's not in full swing until a child is, say, 2.5, when they can actually imagine themselves in a social context. So it's a self-conscious emotion with negative self-evaluation. You had mentioned, considering ourselves favorably in the eyes of others is an instinct that we all have. And when we fear we're going to be considered unfavorably or devalued in the eyes of others, then we have anticipatory shame. And also the self-criticism or self-devaluation tends to be global. In other words, in a moment of shame, it's not there's a part of me that's feeling bad about myself. It's like all of me, That's why some parts psychology approaches like internal family systems so helpful for shame, because just assuming that we're parts breaks up the global assessment, global negative self-evaluation of shame. So it's a self-conscious emotion with negative self-evaluation, and that tends to be global. It's a way of just defining shame. How about yourself? Would you add something to that, Stan?
Well, one of the things that comes from Paul Gilbert's work is the idea of sort of external shame and internal shame, I suppose, and the idea that external shame is that sense that others are perceiving us in these very negative ways, that sort of others see us as inadequate or inferior or no good, whereas internal shame is kind of we see ourselves now as inferior and inadequate and no good, and both, of course, are our own perceptions of things, but he sort of has differentiated those two pieces. Would that be something that sort of resonates for you as well, or what are your thoughts?
Oh, it resonates with me personally as well as professionally.
Exactly.
So, for example, with my public speaking anxiety, it was mostly external shame. I didn't go around carrying a 50-pound suitcase of shame with me, but when I got in a public setting, then it came out. So, but I had a certain vulnerability, which means there was something I was carrying around. So, I would say external and internal is kind of on a continuum.
Yes, that's interesting.
So that I had mostly external shame, but some internal. It wasn't definitely not only external. And in my life, I've never carried around some of this just disabling toxic shame that people carry around if they've suffered, from extreme neglect or abuse and such things.
Yes. Yes. Yeah, I think it is a nice way to think of it on a bit of a continuum, because in some ways, if we have a lot of external shame, at some point we might decide that it must be true. And so therefore we take it on as being true of ourselves, and it moves more into a sense of internal shame. I like
But
how you...
I think
Yes,
we
sir.
all have some internal shame, Stan.
Yeah.
I think we all do. And I've been thinking really deeply about this. This isn't part of the
Yes.
new shame course, but it's part of my experience. And that is that when we're born, we are thrown into duality. We're thrown into vulnerability. We're no longer in the womb. We're very vulnerable. And, the wish to be considered favorably in the minds of others starts from the moment of birth. We have a need to be loved and cared for. This is as profound as taking an in-breath, But from that moment onward, we're also subject to not being loved, not being considered favorably in the minds of others, because everybody is a conditioned human being. Our parents are just people, So right from the get-go, once we're in duality, we actually are starting to accrue experiences of disconnection, which, as they accumulate, start to take the form of shame. In other words, disconnections are, you could say, the building block of shame, and the patterns of disconnection that we may experience from day one are the ones that shape our shame experience. But I think everybody, as long as we're born into duality, feels some, at least, capacity for shame. I mean, certainly evolutionarily, we all have just about everybody has capacity for shame, but the particular texture or contours of shame depend on our learned experience, and I think we all have that. So I think we all have a kind of vulnerability, So in my case, when I was very young, I didn't feel fully welcome in the world. My parents were really nice and things, but I don't know. I always felt I needed to be loved up just a little bit more, and that experience, I think, was just kind of a residual shame that came out in the form of, when I do public speaking, the need to be loved, and I can tell you, Stan, that this personal insight only arose maybe 10 years after I had the first epiphany about the power of self-compassion. But what I hadn't understood is what was the source of the internal shame. What was the source of where did the shame come from that expressed itself so fully when I was trying to do public speaking? And so I needed, actually, in my experience, to go really to early childhood experience and feel what it was. And I feel like that urgency to be appreciated and loved and not devalued in public setting has since been mostly healed, such that I can do talks now and I don't feel the urgency. As a human being, I still wish to be loved. We all wish to be loved, but the urgency has subsided. So there's another way of saying that. I think we all have internal shame, some more than others, but that it's existential. I think it's part of living with a separate skin in duality.
Yeah.
What do you think about that?
Yeah, well, that's right. We're kind of sort of it is built in a way, like we're born with that propensity towards shame, just from an evolutionary point of view, perhaps, or something like that. It's sort of built in for all of us. And then things sort of start to happen when, right on birth, when we're confronted with the sort of the reality of what it is to live, and to live as a social being, and to have certain caregivers in our lives, or attachment figures, and depending on what they do, and lots is sort of bedded down right from those early years, even, perhaps.
Yeah, we are born into a world of duality and disconnection, right? In
Duality
the
and
womb, we are
disconnection.
neither dual nor disconnected. But that's, I think, the vulnerability. And if you even look at like the story of Adam and Eve, it's kind of interesting. Like Adam and Eve ate from the tree of knowledge. It was mostly the tree of duality, right? They were in oneness, naked in the Garden of Eden. They were fine. And then they ate from the, tree of knowledge. And what was the knowledge they got? They got the knowledge of separateness. And the really interesting thing is that Adam and Eve were in the garden in this story, ashamed because they were naked. And then they heard God walking around in the garden. And they were shy. And then, I think God asks, like, why are you hiding? And I think they said something like, because we're naked. And then God said, who told you you are naked? Who told you you are naked? And what this means is that the problem was not that they, violated God's will and ate the apple. The problem is that they developed duality, i.e., in their consciousness, they were kicked out of the garden before they even had to leave the garden. They were out of the garden with duality. Yeah. So anyhow, this is a sad story. Basically, shame co-arises with duality, but we can actually return to the garden because we can begin to soften this sense of duality. And how do we soften the sense of duality? We do this with contemplative practice, where we can actually cultivate compassion for ourselves, compassion for others. We can cultivate wisdom. We can actually discover our inseparable nature, that we are, in fact, not even for a moment separated from anything. And we can have this direct experience in contemplative practice. We can actually return to the garden. It's called liberation. It's called self-realization. We can return to the garden. But the problem is duality. Some people say the problem is ego, but the problem is duality. We are born into it. We feel ashamed. And shame, ultimately, in my view, only gets resolved when the problem of duality gets resolved.
Love it, love it. Is duality, therefore, an illusion? Or when we resolve it, are we now in a different illusion?
No, duality is the illusion. And when we resolve it, we are free of illusion.
Yes,